Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session on taking up the TRC calls to action in our teaching, which is a session that quite a large group of us have been working on, and you'll have a chance to meet everybody in a couple seconds. But this is something that a collaboration between the library and the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching, an opportunity for us to think a bit about the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation and Orange Shirt Day. And how we might not only honor survivors, but also, take actions that can make this day meaningful for us as educators on campus. My name is Curtis Maloli. I am an educational developer at the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching. We have 8 co-facilitators today, and you'll meet them as we go through everything together. In many ways, the idea for this session was actually started by a group of faculty that approached the teaching center this summer. And, it was during that period of activism on campus and, when everyone was discussing both the statue and the name of the institution. And a group of faculty came to the center and said, we want to make sure that this discussion continues into our teaching. And so in August, a group of about 30 faculty members met and had some discussions about ideas for ways to do that. And this is one small piece that came out of that discussion and was inspired by that discussion. And you'll see today we're going to share a resource that the library has been working really hard on. It's a phenomenal resource to help us think about ways, regardless of our disciplines, to bring the TRC calls to action and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report into our teaching in ways that are meaningful to our disciplines. So that's kind of what we're hoping to do today. We'll have an opportunity to work together and thinking through what that might look like. But I want to turn it over to my colleague, Karen, who's going to begin with a land acknowledgement.
Thanks, Curtis. So hi, everyone. I'm Karen Olson. I'm an educational developer at the center. And I wanted to start off by saying that Toronto and University X are in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas to share and protect this land. Subsequent generations of diverse Indigenous peoples, settlers, and newcomers to Canada now have a shared responsibility to take care of this land that we now all live, work, and play on. So for me, as a descendant of white settlers, taking the time to share a land acknowledgement is one step in articulating a need to better understand Indigenous histories and the legacy of colonialism in Canada. One of the resources that I have just on the next slide, if we could move forward on the slides. Great. Is a link to a video produced by colleagues at the University of Alberta, which is intended to guide faculty, staff, and students in crafting land acknowledgements. And 2 of the tips that really stood out to me in this video are 1, to make the land acknowledgement relevant to the topic at hand, and 2, to research the experiences and histories of Indigenous peoples in the places where you live and work. And so to that end, for today, the second resource on the slide at the top there is a link that allows you to type in the year and a location, which then produces a map of where the closest residential schools were to the location that you put in. And if you're like me and you went to school in Canada, or maybe you have children going to school right now, you can put in that location and see just how close a residential school was that operated in that area. And so when I used this link, I found that the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, which is 47 kilometers from where I sit now, operated for 140 years and was closed in 1970. And so from there, you can look up the histories of those institutions and read survivor stories online. And so I would encourage you to take these resources, and thank you, Sarah, for posting them in the chat for us, to do on your own or take into a class or a workshop as part of an activity so that you can authentically follow up on a land acknowledgement by making these connections in a meaningful way.
Thanks, Karen. And if we go to the next slide here, I will say in the chat, Nada has also put an Indigenous education page. This was something that was created this summer as part of National Indigenous Peoples Day. And we are recording this session and we'll be posting it to that page shortly. So recently, we saw the release of the Standing Strong Task Force report and recommendations. And this was, obviously the culmination of a great deal of work on campus. And as part of that, there's a lot of really important information in this report, but as part of it, there's a list of recommendations and a bunch of them are grouped under this category of the responsibility to educate. And I think as we kind of reflect today on, on the meanings of a day about truth and reconciliation and what our responsibilities are as educators, we use this in many ways to inform how we were approaching what we'd like to share and discuss with you today. And the 9th one there, you see there, it says the university should develop a plan to ensure that all academic programs contain mandatory learning opportunities about Indigenous history and Indigenous and colonial relations for all students. And so, what we were thinking a bit about is, well, how do we do that exactly? How is it that we can bring the TRC report itself, the testimony of survivors, the relevance of the calls to action into our teaching? And so we started with this Standing Strong report. And in the next slide here, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of ways that we could do this, but one of the things I think that certainly stood out to me, and that came up again and again in conversations with colleagues and faculty, is the way that the report really usefully distinguishes between the concepts of history and legacy. The history of Egerton Ryerson as an individual is contested, and the report really does a nuanced job of trying to help us to understand, as fulsomely as possible within its context, the history of Egerton Ryerson as an individual. But what the report does really well, and you can see the distinctions in the definitions, this is from the report, is it helps us to understand and separate what the legacy is of not only residential schools, but about Ryerson's contribution to residential schools. And this question of history and legacy is one that is taken up, and we'll show you in a second, taken up again and again in the calls to action itself, and in the TRC report more widely. And so one of the things we wanted to look at today is the ways in which we might be able to address the legacy in our teaching, and thinking about the ways that that legacy, certainly applies to the way that higher education, generally speaking, and knowledge production within it have reproduced a lot of the same kinds of assumptions and practices and colonial relations that even led to the beginning of the residential school system. And so as an example here, if we were to look at the next slide, one of the things we did is we wanted to kind of model a process that, I actually learned this from Kevin Lamoureux, Dr. Kevin Lamoureux at the University of Winnipeg. He worked very closely with the TRC and has served as a vice president at his institution. He's a faculty member now. But I saw him speak a few years ago, and he said, if you want to understand how to activate the calls to action, you should begin with the question, why was this call to action necessary in the first place? And I thought that for me, that was kind of a lightning bolt. That was something that was a really, I thought in really smart way to lead into a discussion of, how we engage the calls to action. And so here we took some examples. Number 24 is about nursing schools. Number 28 is about law schools. Number 86 is about journalism programs and media education. And number 63 is certainly about education more widely. And you'll notice that even in the language for all 4 of these calls to action, just like our Standing Strong report here, it mentions specifically that we need education about the history and the legacy of residential schools. And so that's kind of the focus of what we want to do today. And it's also the focus of how the library has put together an incredible research resource for us to try to take up these calls to action in our teaching. For those of you that are in a nursing school or are teaching in a law school or are teaching in the journalism and media schools, I know these discussions are already underway, and certainly they have a really direct correlation when you look at the TRC report. But certainly, when we look at the wording of all of these calls to action, they're very similar, and they certainly apply to all of our disciplines in really meaningful ways. And so, I'm going to throw it over to Trina from the library here, but part of what we'd like to do with you as a group today is to think through how these logics are, how they extend throughout all of our disciplines, and to be thinking about how we might be introducing that idea to our students and connecting it in really tangible ways to the TRC and to the calls to action. So Trina, I will throw it over to you.
Thanks, Curtis. Hello, everyone. So good to be here and so good to see how many people are here with us. Okay, so my first slide here is to sort of just give some context for library approaches to the calls to action before I jump into the specifics of what we're talking about today. So one of the roadmaps available to libraries regarding truth and reconciliation is the Canadian Federation of Library Associations Truth and Reconciliation Report. So CFLA, Canadian Federation of Library Associations. This image is from that report. It's a medicine wheel, and it's depicted like a pie, sort of divided into 4 pieces to represent the 4 directions. And also each pie is a color that relates to the 4 aspects of our being, which are balanced in healthy living beings. So within CFLA is an Indigenous-led committee that's organized using the medicine wheel as a framework. And I'm Trina Grover. I work as a librarian at Ryerson. I'm a 4th generation Canadian of French descent. So while I was not in a position to lead the committee, I participated on the red team. And some of the work that we did there was, looking at ways to make library spaces and library services and library collections as friendly and welcoming as we possibly can, and really to advocate for standards and procedures that are less racist and less ableist. It's really time to unpack, and kind of question the suitability of the systems, that some of the long-standing systems that are used in libraries, which were created, in the early 19th century with a very European and white focus. So that's just a little bit about, sort of a background about sort of a framework that libraries have, should we choose to follow it. And in the speaker's notes, there's links to more information about why the medicine wheel was chosen for that report, in case you're interested in that. So this slide has a graphic on the right consisting of book jacket images. That's a banner that was created. I want to give a shout out to Emma Stetson, our Career Boost student, who worked on the graphics in this new guide that I'm going to show you. And then on the left side of the slide are the names of and links to some of the guides that focus on Indigenous worldviews on a topic that we've developed in the library, such as Indigenous journalism, Indigenous films and filmmaking, that kind of thing. So as Curtis mentioned, we just created a new guide, and we created it with the help of Nada and Michelle and Curtis. So shout out to them for all the work and the great ideas. They really have some great ideas. So here's the guide. And I'm going to give you just a super quick tour. I want to show you some of the things that we pointed to here. Librarians like to make pathfinders or research guides, libguides, we call them all those things. So here's the one that we've created, and we've really restrained ourselves and not given you 1,000 links. We're really trying to curate a short thing to get you rolling. So I want to give a big shout out to Olivia Wong and Lynn McKenzie, who worked very hard on the content for this. And again, to Emma, our graphic design person. So here's the page that we've created. And you can see on the left, there are 4 main sections: navigating the TRC reports, residential schools, resources by discipline, and support services. So we'll start with navigating. And we start with navigating because, the government of Canada spent about $72 million to support the work of the TRC. and sent 6 people traveling across the country to do interviews with witnesses and relatives. And so the report is so big and it's so overwhelming, but it contains the truth in Truth and Reconciliation. So this is what we need to figure out how to get through it. We need to kind of absorb this a little bit. It's not just read it and learn it, but like this is part of our history, and it's really important that we make use of it because it's really a great resource. But it's 6 volumes and it's crazy long and overwhelming. So here we've got some ideas for you. We've got 3 ways for you to sort of dive into the report. A text way, if you like to read text, there's and some videos and some audio. So let me just give you a quick tour of the text. There's this index. It's a short page and it connects the 94 calls to action to relevant parts of the final report. So here we are. The page actually kind of looks like a PDF file, and this index page area over on the right is so wonderful. It's a list of index pages, and as I said, it takes you directly into the report. So for example, if you're interested in the first 5 calls to action on child welfare, you could go there, and it usually loads pretty quickly. Okay, here we are. So the page on child welfare starts with the calls to action, outlines exactly what they are, and then you scroll down to the bottom of the page, and what you find are deep dives, links directly to the page in the volume where child welfare is discussed, where the calls to action are discussed. And in some cases, it's testimony from a witness, it's a quote, or it's text, a description of the topic and how it relates to the experiences of survivors and the legacy. And I'm going to come back to show you an example of that later. I just wanted to show you this page, and I want to show you also that you don't need to use the back button. You just scroll back up and you come back to this index, right? And I guess one thing I'll just do, scroll right back down and show you like the volume of links. There's so much here. And so what we've done in the library is we've chosen a few examples, and I'll show you where those are. So if you're interested in looking at the text and specific parts of the text under your subject, you can use that index calls to action. The second link is to a series of YouTube videos. If you want someone to read the text to you as opposed to reading it yourself, this TRC reading challenge turned the report into, another media format. It's a series of YouTube videos of people from all over reading the separate sections of the report so that everyone can hear the words. So that's a pretty powerful project and way to maybe split up reading of the report or listening to the report with a group, and then coming back to talk about what you heard and what you learned. The final link under this ways to navigate section is again an audio resource. It's a set of files on Dropbox. They're reading like a 125 page document, the history section of the summary, so it's a smaller, and that might be another way if you want to listen while you're folding laundry or doing something else. And then finally on this page, we've highlighted one of the reports which addresses a topic getting a lot of press this year, and that might be of interest to focus on that report. And then at the bottom, in kind of small font, but we couldn't help ourselves, or I couldn't help myself, actually, I have to take responsibility for this one. This link performs a search in our discovery layer for residential schools in Canada. So you see, you get a nice long up-to-date list of reading. You can pop those into a folder. I have to do a little demo here, and then go to that folder up at the top of your right hand, and you can just email those to yourself for later with full, beautiful links. So that could be another way to navigate. All right, I'm going to speed up a little bit because I am talking a lot, but residential school section, we have 2 sections in this tab. One focusing on the history, the facts. There are just 3 quick links under history, a really brief overview, and another link for you to locate a school on a map, locate one that's close to you. And then the final link under this historical part is, I think, maybe what should be recommended reading for a lot of us at X University is the appendix to the Standing Strong Task Force report, which focuses on ER and his role. So that could be good reading. Following that, we have a section on legacy. So this would be, focusing on the ongoing impacts and listening to survivors talk about their experiences. This site is pretty great. You can see it has faces. It tells you where the school that the person attended. So you could look for a school that was close to you. And they're pretty short videos, and they're very, very personal. And there's some laughter, and there's some a lot of good memories and a lot of good work for you to listen to. Under legacy, we also have a link to text. So the survivors report is a long text that has testimony, transcripts from testimony. And on page 4, we can see the testimony is also categorized. So there's a way to delve into it. But I think the way I was looking at this, and even this categorization seems a little much. So the way I like to look through this is to use Control F, the macro on your keyboard, Control Find, hopefully, or Command F. I don't know if you'll be able to see that in Zoom, but I've just done that. And so if I want to, if I'm thinking about films or filmmaking or movies or media, I would try to think about words that would be used by a person, not necessarily a scholar doing film studies, but so like, say I wanted to see, did they talk about movies? Like, what do they say about movies generally? So I did a Control F for movies, and I don't know if you can see that, but there's 8 instances of the word, occurrences of the word movies in here. And it takes me into the text where people have talked about, when they watched movies. So in this case, watching Western movies, and you can just scroll through to see, their mention of movies. So, mention of, feeling not well, or you could just think about, topics or things that you would like to see if there's any testimony in this survivor speak report. That would be one way to navigate through that. Moving along, the final box on that page includes some help with the research project, the research process, really. So we have a slide deck created by a slide deck and a research activity created by staff in Archives and Special Collections, which links to primary source materials. And this is something that you could just take it and use it in your class. You could adapt it for your class. You can talk to us about helping you to adapt it for your class. So I think the part of this page which we are feeling very good about, we're thinking this is going to be very helpful, and we'd like to extend an invitation to people to talk to us if you want to help grow this section, because this is where we see ourselves really helping people to bring these conversations into class. So the section on resources by discipline starts off with just 2 general works for educators to think about the big picture of indigenizing coursework and what that means beyond checklists. And there's also an open textbook pulling together a guide for curriculum developers. So you might be interested in sort of just taking that big step back before you dive into this. At the library, as well as at the Center for Excellence in Learning Teaching, we're often talking to profs who are really looking for advice and guidance on how to indigenize their curriculums or decolonize their teaching. And so, we can't offer you a checklist. There isn't really a quick answer to this. It's a process. And so that's, stepping back to think about your practices. All of our, instructional practices is really important. So on this section of the library guide, we have 4 sort of areas, 4 disciplines. And what we did is we used that indexed TRC guide and found some examples, some that focus on specific calls. So for example, in journalism and media, it's call number 86. So we've got the text of the call here. And then we have an example of a response to the question, why was this call to action necessary? And some deep dives, some links. You can directly link right to page 195 of the TRC report. So that's very helpful. You can have that link, right to the report, and then people can have a look and read on and see what else is in there. I think I'm going to stop there. I really invite people to, I think it'd be more interesting for you to look at the page on your own than for me to continue. But saying that, is there anything Curtis or Michelle or Nada that I've missed?
Not that you've missed, but I think it would be great just to highlight, Trina had said in the past that, this is really an invitation to grow this page and to be thinking about, and we'll start this process today, but as you're thinking about the ways in which not only the calls to action, but the content of the report applies to the work that you do. If there's ways for us to then bring that together on a page like this that students can find, that faculty can use, our ability to grow this page would be, I think, a wonderful opportunity.
Okay, so back to the slides. There are links in the slides and more information in the speaker's notes, and those will be shared with you. And please do have a look at our guides. And so now I'm going to pass the mic over to someone.
To me, I think.
Karen.
Okay.
Thanks, Trina. Oh, I think we have to go one back. There we go. Thank you. So for the remaining time that we have together, we're hoping to get you involved in a little bit of an activity, a little bit of a discussion where we can start to bridge some of this information and all of those great links that we saw shared with us there to start to think about how we can reflect on the ongoing legacy of colonialism in the way that we teach and in the content of what we teach. And so we thought we would come up with some questions to get this conversation started that help you start to reflect on your own discipline and your own teaching or your own training, depending on where you work at the university, and what meaning is there. So the questions that we came up with, I'm just going to run through them, and then I'm going to pass the floor to Michelle to give us some examples. I'm an anthropologist. I teach in anthropology. So I'm thinking about these questions as in relation to anthropology as I pose them. So who are the key historical figures in your discipline? So think of who are the founding fathers, and often the founding fathers of a discipline are those European or American white men that we turn to often in content. For me, could be Franz Boas in anthropology, an American or a German-born American that we turn to in terms of anthropology teachings from the beginning. What do disciplinary definitions and methodologies say about what is valued or what is true? And how do professionals in your discipline apply knowledge and expertise? So how has that history in your discipline continued to affect the way that we teach our students today, how we guide them, how they learn in our discipline, and how do they apply knowledge and skill in the field beyond the university? And then most importantly, this last bullet point on the slide is what critiques related to your discipline can you find from Indigenous scholars and communities? And certainly in anthropology, its history is fraught with critique because anthropology has historically been known to exploit Indigenous communities, and modern anthropologists are still grappling with that legacy and trying to find better ways of moving forward in the discipline. So let me share the floor with Michelle so she can give us some more examples.
Oh, can you move forward one, Trina? Thank you. So in my undergrad studies, I did a degree in art history, and to a certain extent, this is kind of a gimme in terms of finding critiques available online. But I was just kind of interested in what students would find, for instance, if they did very basic Google searches, if you ask them to kind of explore some of those questions that Karen just reviewed. Because I know that I was never asked to critique or to think critically about the discipline itself when I was in my undergrad. Like I remember very specifically the two required courses for it were Art History 1 and Art History 2, both of which were from a Eurocentric Western lens of art history. Maybe you would look at cave paintings in France, and then that would move through basically the entire history of European art. And we did almost nothing, like for a school that was based in Turtle Island. There was no discussion whatsoever of the art practices of the First Nations and Métis people of this continent. So I thought this has given me an opportunity to reflect on that as well, because it's been an interesting time to kind of be thinking about that. So I just did some sort of basic searches in Google, like not a comprehensive research practice, like that you would do with library resources, and search for Indigenous critiques of art history, which was, a really easy search that you could ask students to do and to then maybe reflect on what they see, or even just something broader like criticism of the discipline. And, like all sorts of stuff comes on, like the canon, the founding fathers, as Karen said, also the view of artists as, the preeminence of one person and the originality of their work, defining Indigenous art as like folk art or primitive art, or American art, in quotes, once again, starting at the point of colonization, right? So like all those kinds of things that, even going back to like when Karen's talking about anthropology, right? And history and all those kind of disciplines that date objects or timelines using like the birth of Jesus as a reference point, even when it's common era, it's still starting for a very specific a point in time that I never really understood, like the point of before the common era, et cetera. Even just calling it the common era, I'm just getting annoyed thinking about it. Like having pan-Indigenous identities in the category of Indigenous art. And then also like the inclusion aspect of the field, right? So there's non-Indigenous curators defining what real Indigenous art is. There's a lack of representation of Indigenous curators and gallerists and scholars and critics. There's all sorts of problematic displays of ceremonial and sacred objects, or thinking of something like Indigenous art as historical rather than living, because no one's actually talking to any Indigenous art practitioners. So there's all sorts of aspects of inclusion that I think will come up a lot in every field, because every field has its own like exclusions and biases, and that are created by people being excluded from the field. So it was a very simple search, and I thought it worked really well. Of course, like I said, this is like an easy discipline to kind of think about from this lens. But if you go to the next slide, Trina, please. I then popped it into the resource that Trina showed from the University of Victoria that's linked on the library site, where you're just searching the TRC for something that might be relevant. And I think, when you looked up art in the TRC, like it comes to this part in volume 6 about the roles of museums and archives, and what the roles of museums and archives are as sites of public memory and national history. And if they're seen as this kind of neutral, objective place for information and history to be displayed, but they actually have like a message that they're sending, like then what are those messages? So like how can museums think about the stories that they're telling and confront their colonial past, and think about, the kinds of things that they're displaying and who's involved in creating those displays and how they're sort of representing colony and empire. Those things are all really important to have as a discussion with students. So I thought, that tool that Trina was showcasing was a really good one to like dig into those things where it's so many volumes of text, but you can find something that is really helpful for thinking about the way that all this information can be used within your classroom. And I think Curtis has an example next in a different field that will help deepen understanding.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. This one's not specifically from the TRC report itself, but this year I've been collaborating with the Urban Water Research Center and the Office of Social Innovation. And we're working on a curriculum project where we're bringing together students in an engineering course, a chemistry course, a geography course that is looking at colonial infrastructures, and a sociology course on Indigenous feminisms. And all of the students are looking at the First Nations water crisis and the logics that continue to perpetuate that crisis. And also what it might mean to try to solve a crisis like that. And, I thought it was really interesting. This quote was shared with me by Sheila Boudreau, who teaches at X. And, in this case, speaking specifically about the work that, in this case, biological and chemical engineers do when they work with First Nations communities. And, even some of the ways that the logics that students learn in school about how to exercise their discipline or put their discipline into action, how a lot of these practices reproduce colonial relations, even in professional work atmospheres. And so in this case, this is a quote from Don Martin Hill, who's an associate professor at McMaster. And you can see here, it says, one of the things is we ask different questions and we look at different data sets of what we might want and what the elders want us to look at. For example, heavy metals was not with the science team with all the background that they have and expertise was intending to look at, because that's not what the data told them to look at. It was the elders who said, you need to look at this because this is a problem. So I think that it's not just about sharing data, it's about co-creating that data that makes sense to First Nations. And then secondly, we have people who understand how to clean up water without being intrusive and invasive, but using traditional knowledge and ways of knowing to do that. And it says here, most First Nations would agree that we're not even at the table, let alone co-creating ways to improve the quality of our water source. And so, like, as we're getting into this question of, the disciplinary assumptions, not just in kinds of knowledge production, but also in the ways in which we ask students to use knowledge that they're taking from our courses and activate it in the world. To be deconstructing these moments with students and to have them doing a bit of metacognitive work about their discipline and what their discipline is, I think is a really wonderful way from all of these examples for us to think about bringing up the TRC calls to action and this work in our disciplines, regardless of what they are. So we wanted to get everyone thinking about this today and thinking about your own discipline. So I'll turn it over to Nada and Sarah.
Thanks, Curtis. So at this time, we would like to have some more active, connections with you, since reconciliation is both individual as well as collective journey. So we will do a little activity, and Sarah will share her screen. We will use Padlet, and I will share a link in the chat. So please use this link to log into that other platform that Sarah is right now sharing on the screen. If you never used it, you can use + to add comments. And basically these questions that Karen posed to us a little bit earlier, we would like together to think, reflect, and share our thoughts on them. And Sarah will walk us through a few examples.
Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Sarah Mazrui. I'm also an educational developer at the center. So by background, I'm a planetary scientist and an astronomer. So I was trying to reflect on how could I take in the questions that Karen posed earlier on into my own teachings and into my classrooms. So in the first column here, we have who are the key historical figures in your discipline. And feel free to, as Nada mentioned, use the + to, add your discipline and add an example. For example, for me in astronomy and planetary science, when I think about some of the key historical figures, I think about Galileo. If you share the same discipline, you could add a comment so that they could all go into the same discipline. But if it's a new one, please feel free to add something into the using the +. What do disciplinary definitions and methodologies say about what is valued or what is true? So currently I'm teaching a course called Life and Death in the Solar System. And an equation that we often think about is the Drake equation, trying to estimate the number of intelligent civilizations that are capable of communicating with the Earth. But every term in that equation has such a westernized definition to it. For example, when I think about, when we talk about life, intelligent life, what is capable of communicating with humans, but it's only thought about from the Western perspective. And if we were to indigenize the Drake equation, that equation could look completely different. So taking a step back and really thinking about the main definitions and methodologies that drive our disciplines. In the third column, we have how do professionals in your discipline apply knowledge and expertise? What are some traditional ways that we do things in our discipline? For example, in astronomy, historically, it's been that astronomers have a greater right to telescopes and building telescopes on indigenous land than indigenous peoples rights. That is slowly changing. People are standing up to it, but we see time and time again huge telescopes being built on indigenous land without having a conversation or without bringing indigenous peoples into those conversations and into those decision makings. And lastly, what kind of critiques related to your discipline can you find from indigenous scholars and communities? Again, historically, when we teach astronomy, when we teach physics, when we teach planetary science, it all comes from a Western perspective. But as we know, indigenous peoples have a great relationship to the land, to the skies. A lot of stories and a lot of traditional knowledges are missing from our textbooks and our classrooms currently. So talking about taking back astronomy, sharing some of the stories from indigenous peoples and from their stories about astronomy. So we hope that you can take some time to add some thoughts to this Padlet. Feel free to use the plus sign to add in your discipline and some ideas. We'll give everybody some time to start populating the Padlet, and then we'll invite you to share some of your ideas with everybody else.
I think we're kind of nearing the end of our session here. Trina, do you want to say any more about the updating of that page?
I think we're very interested in working with faculty to develop specific pages related to your course or to your discipline on a specific call to action. So that's where I see the page growing and maybe migrating to another platform depending on how big we grow. So I do welcome people to get in touch with your liaison librarian, or get in touch with me if you want to talk about developing something together. I appreciate that there's this sense that librarians can compile a bunch of resources, and definitely, we're good at long lists. But I'm not sure that's the approach that's going to work here. I think shorter is better. And that's, that's why I kept the guide sections as short as they are. So I just always caution people against saying, let's compile a bibliography. If we want people to read things, we have to curate things in a really specific way and make it very targeted. And everyone here knows that because you're all very busy. So let's focus on that together.
Thanks for participating today. Thank you all for attending this. As you can obviously see, we're all of us as educational developers, librarians, we want to do this work with you. So don't hesitate to reach out, and let's get this going.